Hi, and welcome to the I Teed Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 68. What can lobotomies teach us about your host's file? So, it might surprise you that people are complicated. Their minds are complicated, their reactions are complicated, their emotions, they're pretty complicated. One of the things that has come across over the last couple of centuries has been the development of psychology and psychiatric care as a specialty. And the purpose of psychiatry and psychiatric care is to identify where patients or people need mental care and need to be assisted in some way to get their emotions under control and for them to become productive members of society. Lots of reasons for this. I have no idea what the cause is. I'm not even going to speculate. However, a lot of people have done that for me instead, specifically with the case of lobotomy. So, lobotomy is a procedure where essentially you stick an ice pick through the sinus cavities that exist behind your eyeball, and you pierce the skull through that eye socket, or through that sinus cavity, because that's where apparently there's a weak point in your skull, and basically shove that ice pick into your brain and just kind of jiggle it around. Now, the way that they say that that a lobotomy is supposed to be performed is that it is severing connections between the brain and the prefrontal cortex, which, sure, yeah, you turn that into jelly, I'm sure, yeah, it's going to be severed. But let's just call it what it is. You're literally turning this brain or part of the brain into jelly. Now, the reason they came up with this specific procedure is that the purpose was to kind of calm people who were otherwise psychotic or had severe emotional issues. And this was first performed in the 1930s. You know, back when medicine was nothing but whiskey, hacksaws, and cocaine. And if you had ghosts in your blood, you should do cocaine about it. That's very much when this procedure was born out. And it was not necessarily met with success. Patients who received the lobotomy reported issues of headaches. They were often emotionally unstable or may not even be emotionally there. Sometimes they basically became invalid. They couldn't take care of themselves. But for whatever reason, they thought that there was enough success of this that they continued to do it. And that's, to me, kind of crazy. They were like, you saw this failure rate where people were just like drooling messes. But no, let's keep doing this. It's obviously helping. I mean, they're not screaming anymore, so at least there's that. They may be drooling on the floor, but at least they're not screaming at me. And so, you know, the lobotomy continuing to be used could be considered controversial up until the late, really until just about 1970, 1980, when it all of a sudden started becoming a negative thing to do. Like, they no longer wanted people to do it. And it was actually banned in 1977, but officially the last one done in the United States was in 1982. So, you know, it's still, it was still being done even after it was being banned. And so what we see with lobotomy is that it was kind of a solution, or it was a solution that didn't work, but people implemented anyways because it fixed a specific problem that people were trying to solve. To give you just one more piece of context, John F. Kennedy famous head exploder or exploded head, and also president of the United States, had a younger sister growing up, and this younger sister was very much had some sort of psychological issue, and instead of going through therapists and doing all of that, which probably wasn't available in the 50s, so instead of doing the psychiatric care that wasn't available, they did the psychiatric care that was available. They gave her a lobotomy. And basically, yes, it calmed her down, but effectively she was an invalid. She could not take care of herself, and basically turned in from what all accounts was a normal, very, very active young lady to a, drooling vegetable, which is probably not the correct term to use, but whatever. They turned her into a shell of a person. And so, this is all something that could have been avoided with proper analysis and proper care and just a little bit more functionality in terms of psychiatric care, which we have gotten to now. We've learned better. We have done better. And so, well, what the fuck does any of this have to do with computers? God damn, that was dark. Buckle the fuck up, guys. It's going to get darker in these next episodes. Oh my God. Anyways, hosts files. Your host file on your computer. If you have a computer that has been built in the last, half century, you likely have a file that exists somewhere in your file system called hosts or LM hosts. There's probably other permutations of this file, but
basically we call it the hosts file, and in Windows it's the host file, and this file is it's not very special. Like when you open it up, it's just basically got a few lines that kind of explain how to use it and a little bit of what it does. But basically what a host file does is it identifies the specific routes or IP addresses to define a host name as. And so, if you wanted to manually point to google.com to another IP address, say you've wanted to point google.com to, hell, you could go find hell.com and find that IP address and then point Google to that IP address. And then your computer, instead of going, when you typed in google.com, it would go to hell.com. Now, there are other considerations about what happens when you do this, just like there are other considerations to what you do with lobotomy. But in the end, a host file is effectively useful for redirecting traffic and can be used to treat a very specific or address a very specific concern. For instance, one of the ways that we've seen host files used productively is inside of an environment where there is an issue in the fact that the company has named their interior domain as the same as their exterior domain. And to kind of give you an idea of why this would be a problem, so let's say you have a company called itedmyself.com, and you have a domain called itedmyself.com, but that's also what you named your internal domain, itedmyself.com. Well, what happens is when you attempt to go to your own website, itedmyself.com, you end up going to the domain controller because that in your internal network is what is identified as the host or as the backend IP address of itedmyself.com. So instead of referencing itedmyself.com as the domain controller, you could identify itedmyself.com as the IP address of the web server. And therefore, when you want to access your own website, you can then be redirected to that location instead of your domain controller. Now, for those of you who are more technically savvy, you're probably like, no, that's the worst way to fucking do it. Use DNS redirector. Goddamn. What are you, a moron? And I have to agree. That is absolutely the worst way to do it. You don't use a hosts file for that, but that is conceivably one legitimate use for it. Another legitimate use for your host file is that you could effectively black hole a website. So, for instance, if you had a specific website that you didn't want people to visit, you could point it to 0.0.0.0. It won't resolve, and then they can't visit that website. They can still go to the IP address if they know it, but for the vast majority of methodologies, users, and other folk, when they do ping and then that website, it will come up with 0.0.0.0. And so what you could effectively do is, if you have a list of websites that you don't want people to visit, you could add them to your host file. Again, another legitimate use. Is it the best way? No, use a fucking content filter. But it's another potential legitimate use. Just like there are probably potential legitimate uses for a lobotomy, even though, I can't think of a fucking single one, but I'm also not a psychiatrist or a psychiatric care specialist or whatever the fuck you call it, a lobotomist, whatever. So a hosts file could be used to do all this, but what you're effectively doing when you're using your host file is you're kind of not giving your computer any sort of option. And so, say for instance, you want to block all ads from Amazon because Amazon has a lot of ad services that it serves up. And so you choose to block the entirety of AWS. You're like, anything AWS, go to 0.0.0.0. I'm going to black hole AWS. Well, see, the problem with that is when you do that, half the internet is on AWS. I'm sure my podcast, the actual host of my podcast storage, is located on AWS. I'm sure of it because it's cheaper than Azure. And I'm cheap and lazy as fuck. I don't really care. And I'm sure it's stored on AWS on the back end. So you wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't want to add AWS to your host's file because it's very sloppy. It's a very messy way to do that. And you're effectively cutting yourself off from the internet, and you're giving yourself an inability to troubleshoot any sort of problem that you have with that route or that stream. And so it just becomes this exercise where you are effectively destroying your own ability to function. You're destroying your machine's ability to communicate outside of itself. You're not giving it any chance. You're not doing things the proper way, because you could conceivably configure your computer to do a whole lot more with better tools. So, for instance, instead of blocking ads through, black holing AWS in its entirety, what you could do is you could use a content filtration system and tell it, I don't want to see ads. Or if you didn't want to pay for a content filtration system, you could use a free content filter like a Pi-hole, which is a DNS server that sits on your network, and you can redirect traffic to it. Not necessarily something that new IT folk or people who have no IT experience would want to do, but definitely a possibility. It's definitely one of those things that you can add to your network, and it's free. And Pi-hole is definitely one of those things you can operate. The Pi-hole project is an amazing effort of a bunch of people to try to make the internet better, try to bring the internet back to not an insane cascade of ads and shit. So, that's one way to address a lot of this. Another way that you could address some of the threats or unwanted things that might come across the internet is to make sure that you have a firewall. For fuck's sake, the hosts file, you could effectively, I guess you could make one that's complicated enough to operate as a firewall, but that's what a firewall is for. You can do that yourself with just a fucking firewall. Use the tool that's meant to do that. You have a firewall on your system. If you have a modern operating system, you have a firewall, whether it be Windows Advanced Firewall or uncomplicated firewall or NetPlan or whatever. You have a firewall on your system that can be modified, not NetPlan, IP tables, that can be modified to function however you want. Now, in reality, if you're a tech coming up, and really the reason for this episode, the entire reason for this episode is that I had a technician at an organization spend an hour and a half troubleshooting a problem on their own computer with a tool that I provide. And this tech went back and forth with me and was insistent that there was a problem with the website. And because, it was a new platform and I'm not entirely familiar with every error message that came across, it was one of those things like, well, you're the only one having this problem. It kind of does have to be on your side. And I don't know that I can help you because you're a technician and you should be able to figure this out yourself. Anyway, he spun his wheels again for like an hour and a half, probably longer, before he thought, hey, I made a change to my hosts file. Maybe I should undo that change. And so then when he blanked out his hosts file and came back to just a regular computer, lo and behold, he was suddenly able to access this tool. And so it was a whole situation where he was part of an organization that had all of these other tools. They have a web filter. They have firewalls. They have all sorts of things. But he took it upon himself to basically lobotomize his computer because he felt that was the best way to operate within an organization. And it's not. Your hosts file should not be used except as a last resort in very specific circumstances. You may want to configure a hosts file when you are in an extremely secure environment where you must make sure that a machine does no communication outside of this very specific line of servers or networks. You may want to do that. But in reality, when you're working in a regular organization where you're not underneath some sort of Damocles sword to ensure that you are as secure as possible, don't touch your hosts file. Use all of the other tools that are available to you. Because what you're doing is you're just complicating things. You're taking a drastic step to prevent communication that can be done properly through the other channels. Give the psychiatric care to your computer. Don't just lobotomize it. Don't shove that ice pick up its nose and rattle it around there until its prefrontal cortex turns into jelly. Do it the right way. Edit your DNS. Use your DNS resolvers appropriately. Use your content filtration properly. Use your firewalls properly. And you'll find that when you do this, you will have fewer problems that you're having to go through a complicated method to troubleshoot. And so as you work through technology and as you work as a tech, you'll find opportunities to do things like this, where you'll have a host file of some sort or a more complicated way to configure something. And it may seem like a good idea to modify that and do it this really complicated, or maybe to you it's very simple. But what you should do is you should check yourself and identify whether or not you're doing something the right way. Because if you're not able to centrally manage something, and it is something that can possibly be centrally managed, you should probably rely on your centrally managed tool. Well, anyways, guys, that's all I have time for today. And I hope you guys have a great day. Ugh.